G'day guys. As I often do, I've been reflecting on the previous verse, and every time I teach on a particular verse, I go away and I start to reflect on it. And I think there are some things that God brings to mind for me, and I hope they're for you as well. I said in that last verse, in verse 111 of Ephesians, I talked about the way in which God has got a great plan, and that Paul describes it as this wonderful good news of Jesus, and that the good news is that God is at work in all things in order to bring about the governing of Christ over all things, and that in the fullness of times, all things are going to be summed up in him. And then I look too at the fact that in this wonderful governing of Jesus, this rule of this Prince of Peace, um, that we have got a special place with God because God has chosen us for his portion. I talked about that, and I talked about the tension of that. The fact that we focus on this grand plan of God that he is definitely doing, that is definitely being worked out through all history, that God has got a very clear mind about and a very clear purpose and a very clear action about in all the events of life, in everything, in all history. I talked about that. But I became so aware that it is easy to get a glimpse of that and go, wow, because it gives us a kind of a backdrop in which we can understand all the events of our own lives and our own thoughts. And we can suddenly see, actually, this is the big picture. This is the picture behind all of our experiences and all of our feelings and all of our interpretations of events. And we can suddenly see a wider, bigger picture and go, oh, wow, that's the big picture. Hey, that is, in fact, a good picture. It's a little bit like understanding that the sun is actually shining behind that dense cloud that is raining on us. And suddenly we realize, hey, there is a cloud, there's a sun that is just pouring out sunlight behind that everywhere. And just behind that cloud, the sun hasn't changed, and it's huge, and it's full of light. And we can see that, and we can get a glimpse of it. And then we can go right back to thinking about the things that we've always thought about, that have always consumed our minds. Now, the things that consume our minds and the feelings that we have about those thoughts end up, for us, the fact that we are constantly thinking about them and constantly feeling about them tells us that we're actually making those things more important in our lives, more important than the good news of Jesus. Now, logically, we go, no, of course Jesus is more important. What God is doing through Jesus is obviously more important, and we know that. But the fact that we let those thoughts, those other thoughts and those other feelings consume all of our thinking means that in the daily routine of our lives, we've actually believed something that isn't true. We've actually displaced the good news of Jesus with the things that worry us, with the things that grieve our hearts, with the events and the people and the circumstances and the inner dialogues of our minds. We've let those things become the big things. We've let those things shape our hearts and our inner world and our dispositions and our attitudes. And I know this is the case, and I know that you do this as well. I know that you let certain things, and we don't feel like we're letting it, but in fact we are. We are actually saying, these thoughts that have been running through my mind, they may be depressing thoughts, they may be sad thoughts, they may even be joyous thoughts. We may even have got something into our minds that we've suddenly made, oh, this is my hope for the day. We may be thinking, oh, I'm going to buy this house, or I'm going to buy this car, or I'm going to get this girlfriend or boyfriend, or I'm going to go to the movies tonight. Or I know these are trivial things, but we end up making those things that we focus our lives on. The little things we focus our lives on, either for hope or we focus on them in worry and despair. And I know you do it, and I know I do it as well. I've done it sometimes for decades. And I find what God is doing in my life is getting me simply to honor what he says and believe what he says, and take what he says is valuable as truly valuable, and take the things that I've made value and actually give them the right position that they actually have in comparison to the good news of Jesus. Now, all these things that take over my mind and my feelings, where I find that I'm suddenly overwhelmed by a feeling, or my mind is just churning away, those things are manure. Now, that's a nicely put word, manure. Now, it's like having stuff on the bottom that you've just trodden in, and you can smell it, and it stinks, and you want to just scrape it off your boot and just leave it somewhere. But the problem is we've made that thing as really important. We've made it our food. We've made it the thing that we scatter on our carpet. We've made it the thing that we take to bed and stuff under our pillow. We've put the stuff in our mouths and before our eyes, and we've been absorbed in our lives with those things. And really, it is manure in comparison to the wonderful greatness of the good news of Jesus. Now, hear this. I'm calling it manure in comparison. And that's actually what it is. It's a bit like Paul in Philippians, where he counts all his past and all the things of his status and what he's been, a Hebrew of Hebrews and all those things. He says he counts all of that rubbish in comparison to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ. Now, this manure, we need to actually see it for what it is, and see it for the fact that we've actually been treating it as something that is important in comparison to the gospel of Jesus. Now, the reason I've called it manure isn't just because of contrast. I call it manure because the picture that I used in that last video was the idea from verse 111, where it says that God works all things according to the counsel of his will. The analogy that I used was the idea of a farmer ploughing everything in the field. Everything that's in the field, God ploughs. And that is all things on heaven and in earth, on earth and in heaven. God actually uses all of those things and works the lot to bring about his good purpose. That's what I said in that video. And that told you something about how significant God's purpose in Christ actually is, and our place in that. However, when we think about manure has its place. We need to think about all the painful things of our lives and all the things that we've made into treasures and valuable things that we've got our eyes focused on. See it as manure, but then understand, hey, manure is good in the field, because manure is used in the field by the farmer to actually grow his crop and fulfill his purpose. And we need to very intentionally see the things of our lives and actually declare to God the things of our lives, the things that I've been so absorbed in, and we've got to actually name those things, and we need to do it again and again and again, because we've reinforced in our lives the fact that those things are so important that we have to focus on them all the time. We need to, again, do the opposite process and actually say, no, it's manure. And if it's manure, it's for the field. And if it's for the field, it's for the farmer to plough it. And if the farmer's going to plough it, he's going to bring out his good product, which is the governing of Jesus over all things in the future, and our inclusion with Jesus in that. So we need to see our manure, not just as stuff that is so either yucky that it gets our attention, or so we make it out so wonderful that it actually takes our attention away from Jesus. We need to actually see that manure as very intentionally for the field, for God to plough, for God to work, for God to bring about his purpose, and agree with God about that, and not see it in some other way. I think I'll leave it at that. I'll leave you with God about that one. I don't say this lightly. I don't want to treat things that have been deeply painful in our lives as if they're just nothing. I'm not saying they're nothing, but I am saying that we need to see them in God's perspective and let the good news of Jesus and the wonderful news of his rule and our inclusion into God's purpose in that, we need to let that displace everything in our thinking that had priority position, and let the good news of Jesus have priority position. I don't care if you're worried about your work, if you're worried about your family, if you're worried about your health, if you're worried about somebody you dearly love, if you're worried about where you fit into things and how well you're doing, all of those things are manure in comparison to the surpassing greatness of knowing the good news of Jesus. So I encourage you to actually believe God about that. It won't feel right to begin with. It'll feel like you're just trying to play mind tricks. But over time, what happens is the wonder and the glory of the gospel, as we focus on what it is that God has actually given, we slowly in our hearts gain a greater revelation by the Spirit of how wonderful in fact it is. and it starts to displace all of the other stuff. And I know God's already been on that journey with you, but he wants to continue it in all of those things that take up your thinking. I am not saying start to think about all the things that are manure, but what I would say, if God brings things to mind that are displacing his gospel, the good news of Jesus, then he wants you to think about those things properly and put them in their proper perspective. Okay, have a good day. Bye-bye.